think, went to is it a nephew's?
We know where they are.
Yeah, they told us they were going to be here.
Graduation.
Some graduation of, that's a nephew, isn't it?
Yeah,
A guy that's, okay.
they come here to our church.
Yeah, they come, he and his wife and kids come. He's graduating from EMT school or something. And then Roger, I guess, has class. I don't know where Michael is, but
I'm right here.
okay. Everybody seems to be in some kind of mood. I don't know what kind of mood it is, but all right, we are in Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11. Most of the one of the most illustrious, shall we say, chapters in the Bible, as it speaks of prophecy concerning Israel, both short term and long term. We were back, I think, in verse 29. I don't know if we finished that. We'll go back and kind of review that, and then we'll go from verses 30 and 31. We'll read through verse 33. Don't know if we'll get to that. I want to speak again of the fact that much of the scriptures that we're studying have a prophecy that is short term, but also goes into long term, becomes more long term as the chapter advances. We'll go back to verse 29 and read, "At the time appointed, he shall return," speaking of the king of the north, "and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. For the ships of Kittim shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And arms shall stand on his part. They shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, shall take away the daily sacrifice. They shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. They that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, by captivity, by spoil many days." Now, in verse 29, we saw last week where the king's plotting and plans would not be successful. You see here, though it's not alluded to directly, you do see where God's hand is at play. It's interesting in what we've read and what we will read, how God allows a lot of things, and he allows a lot of destruction to take place among his people. But there are perimeters that God places around the things that happen and what he allows. And you see hints of it even when it's not directly, at least not yet, related to his people. And what I'm referencing is verse 30 when we talk about the Holy Covenant. But God still puts perimeters. The king of Syria plots it out. He plans what he's going to do, but he is not successful as he thinks he will be, and not in the way he will be. We've already seen in previous verses where the king would plot and plan, and he'd have his vision of how he wants to set up even the king of the south, or the country to the south, which was Egypt. He would plot and plan and put people into place, prop them up in their regimes so that he would still have power, only to find that the people didn't always cooperate. So some of that was it was God's doing, but God wouldn't let him succeed as he wished to succeed. So therefore, we see the hand of God. Verse 29 says, at the time appointed, he shall return. That doesn't mean necessarily that's just his planning. That's God allowing things to happen. So I just want to keep emphasizing, because a lot of this will draw into where we're at and what will be coming for our future. And I say our future, I don't mean necessarily you and I, though it could very well happen. But what will happen in this time, God has his plans, and God has his perimeter set up. So in verse 29, he's not going to succeed as he expected. Verse 30, he talks about the ships of Kittim, and basically, and you have all kinds of commentators landing on all sorts of things. If you pick up a commentary on Daniel, on a lot of places, you'll find that there is tremendous disagreement on various things. It's generally believed that the ships of Kittim are basically the Romans coming after him. And so it says that the ships of Kittim shall come against him, the king of the north. Now notice this, and this is pretty interesting, verse 30. It says that therefore he shall be grieved. He shall be grieved, because he's facing stiff opposition. The Romans are coming after him, and he faces opposition. And it's to say that he's grieved is, I won't say it's an understatement, but he's upset because his plans didn't work out. He's got opposition now that he can't just override and overcome. And so it says, and he returns and have indignation. Now notice the grieving and the indignation. This means he becomes wrathful. He becomes very wrathful. And so this means he starts plotting. He starts plotting. And then it says his indignation comes against the Holy Covenant, which is back to God's people. So you have the king of the north, you have Israel, then you have the king of the south, you have the Syrian in between the people of God, and then you have the Egyptians. So it's interesting here that as he is facing opposition from the Romans, who are in alliance with Egypt, you begin to see that he starts wanting, as most people in power have, he is so full of himself, so prideful of what he's done and who he is, that he has to find somebody to beat up on. It's kind of like when I was in school, when I was in grade school, we had this guy who thought himself to be the cock of the walk. I mean, he was the tough guy in our class. And he messed with everybody, and he intimidated everybody, until he messed with a guy who was a young classmate who was very quiet, didn't do much, never caused trouble. But when this bully started picking on him, this guy kind of quit being quiet, and he beat him up. He beat him up. So the bully, in his frustration, because he just got his lunch handed to him at recess, finds somebody else that he knows he can beat up, and he goes after him. He goes after him. That's kind of what I think about here. The king to the north, he can't beat Rome. He can't beat them. So what does he do? He turns his anger toward Israel. Now it kind of, and I don't want to chase a rabbit, but it kind of makes me think of some of the motivations through history to the Jews. It makes me kind of wonder if, God's people have always been hated throughout their history. But it kind of makes you wonder why sometimes some motivations just been because we hate the Jews. They just hate the Jews. But it also kind of makes you wonder if sometimes some action against Israel through history, or God's people through Israel, has not come as a result of the fact that they seem easy prey to powers that be, and they know, or they think they know, that they can defeat them and destroy them. And so he no longer at this point can come against Egypt, because Rome is in alliance with them, and they start coming after him. So a guy goes back home and he kind of sulks, and then he decides, okay, I'll go pour my anger out upon Israel. So he has indignation against the Holy Covenant, which really means beyond just the people, it's this issue that they are, quote unquote, the people of God. Now notice, so shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. Now, according to history, and I'm going to read you some, and it's interesting. Again, we don't hold to the Catholic Bible, but there's some good historical books that talk about the history of Israel a few hundred years after Daniel and such, and much of this short-term stuff is just that. But I'm just going to read you a little bit. Some of you may know the story about Antiochus basically being in the middle of a circle and being told, in essence, that you can decide if you're going to go home or what you're going to do. So he goes home. He goes home. Now, we won't go into all of that. I just want to read to you some, again, about the history. His rage, and I'm going to just read the quote. His rage at the humiliation which had been inflicted on him knew no bounds, but the only vent he could find for his wrath was the little land of Palestine. What he did was he aligned himself with some Jews, apostate Jews, who wanted to become, I'm just going to use a vernacular and make it a little easier to understand. They wanted to be like the world. They want to be like everyone else. So he tapped into this group who didn't want to be faithful to what the covenant called for between God and the Jews. So he tapped into that, and he sent 22,000 men to destroy Jerusalem. He massacred thousands in the city, murdered the worshipers in the temple, putting an end to the temple worship and ritual, tore up the city, and then set fire to it. Then he published a decree that all upon the issue of death should conform to the Greek religion, and that the temple itself should be consecrated to Jupiter Olympus. And now this is interesting to me. Identifying himself with the God. Moreover, he claimed worship also for himself. In other words, he demanded that they worship him. Now you see here, again, this is short term, but it's also long term into what we see in 2 Thessalonians about the Antichrist. The Antichrist will not be satisfied with people liking him and honoring him. He will demand worship. He will demand worship. So you see, even in this historical fulfillment, short term, you see some prophetical aspects of the coming situation with the Antichrist. And so this is kind of what's going on in verse 30. You see, it says, he'll have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. That basically means he'll align himself with the Jews who are not desirous to stay faithful to God and that desire to be like the rest of the world. And so that's what's happening in verse 30. Now let's look at verse 31. Let's look at verse 31. If I can turn my page. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Now the word, this is kind of flowing into what I just mentioned, but it's also alluding to what will happen to a great degree when in the end times, in the last of the fulfillment of Scripture. Now the word arms in verse 31 basically is forces or armies. So it means the armies shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength. Now notice that. Notice that. There are three things that happen in verse 31. There is, first of all, and again, this is historical, but it's also lending itself to the prophetical long term. Three things happening here. Number one, there is the pollution of the sanctuary of strength. The pollution means basically it becomes unholy. It becomes unholy. They failed to recognize and bring the world into that which is God's sanctuary. So you have here a sense of bringing idolatry and such as that into the sanctuary of strength. Number two, they shall take away the daily sacrifice. Pretty well speaks for itself. The daily sacrifice in the temple. And then thirdly, they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Now you remember Jesus mentioned in Matthew 24, verse 15, the abomination as far as prophecy goes. So again, short term moving in to long term. But what they did, and I'll read this to you again. Again, this is historical. But the abomination that maketh desolate, it says in verse 31, means the abomination that appalleth. And this is the appalling nature of what they do to God's sanctuary. And that means basically that they built a heathen altar in the sanctuary. Just read again to you from history. They attacked, I don't want to read all this, but the desire was to destroy the worship of the covenant with God and to bring their own worship into the sanctuary. Antiochus, according to history, ordered the ceasing of sacrifices and of the observance of Sabbath ceremonies and festivals. He prohibited the rite of circumcision, which was, as you well know, a covenant between God and his people, and destroyed copies of the scriptures. He replaced the Feast of Tabernacles by a Feast of Bacchus, introduced lewd practices among the youth of the city, and dedicated the temple again to Jupiter Olympus. A heathen, here's what I wanted to get at. A heathen altar was erected upon the altar of burnt offerings, and for over 3 years the temple services were suspended. Many faithful Jews suffered because of their refusal to eat unclean meats or to defile themselves by obedience to the royal decree. Some were tortured or flogged, or others even put to death. Now, something that's interesting to me that I didn't think about, or I've never thought about, maybe it's just me, is think about the history of Daniel. About the history of Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children. In a way, that was a foreshadowing of what is going on here. And this is a foreshadowing of what will happen again. But it's just kind of interesting that as this prophecy is being told to Daniel, and this will take place in the future, there are some similarities that Daniel himself has gone through that is just kind of interesting, that taps in to the way Daniel was in being faithful to his God and not defiling himself and such. But you see here in this, again, historical prophecy, how that this will happen, and yet there will be people who will stay faithful. Look at verse 32. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. And that just seems to me that those who will transgress among the Jews, transgress against the covenant, he's going to win over by his flatteries. And we've seen this word flatteries before. This king was very astute at using his words and his quote-unquote covenants and alliances. He was very astute at telling people what they wanted to hear in order to manipulate them. And that's what he's doing here. He taps into the Jews who are worldly, and this is my expression, it's not in Scripture, but who are worldly enough that don't want to stay faithful in their covenant with the Lord, he taps into that dissatisfaction and uses terms, uses acts to bring them in, because he knows that if he can do that, then what he's going to do is, if you will, divide and conquer. He knows he's going to be able to do that. So he uses that, whether they be words or acts, whatever. He's a king. He may not do much against the Romans right now, but he can manipulate, so he manipulates. He manipulates. And so that's what you see in verse 32. But look at the second part of verse 32. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. In other words, there are going to be those who are going to stay faithful to the covenant. And it is expressed in verse 32 that they will be strong. In other words, as is always the case in history, and will continue to be the case, this is a principle, doesn't matter if it's Jews or Gentiles, that as times begin and circumstance begin to really test the commitment of faithfulness, there will be those who will be faithful. We see that when Jesus was talking about the end times, even about churches and the Lord's people, that there would be a falling away. There will be a falling away. We go and we quote that. But there's also recognition that there will be those who will be faithful. And so you have that playing out among the Jews with the covenant. There will be those who are strong, and they shall be faithful. They shall be faithful. They will stay with the covenant. There will be those who won't, but there will be those who do. And so you see that while the king has some influence, there will be those who will stand their ground. There's always a remnant. There's always a remnant. And it's interesting here that, and I don't know what's going on in the mind of Daniel, but I think Daniel is pretty well remembering his own experiences and his own observations. But at the same time, this has to be affecting him. All right, anything before I see Riley going, time's up, but anything before we quit at verse 32? Anyone? All right, if not, we'll pick up verse 33 next week. It just seems so fun. I feel like somebody's coming in a door at a business. But we'll pick up verse 33 next week. And as the chapter proceeds, we're going to see a big difference in time as verse 36 starts. Yes, sir.
To be clear, well, I guess the king being referred to here is the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, correct?
Yeah, I think so.
After which Antioch in Syria was named.
Yeah. But now I think this Antiochus IV, number 4.
Antiochus IV Epiphanes is the Jew leader. He's the one.
Yeah.
Did this.
Yeah, he was called, I think we talked or saw a few weeks ago. They called him Madman, the Madman. All right, thank you.
I guess a lot of this is dealing with that intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New.
Yeah. All right, anything else? If not, we'll see you, I guess, here in a minute.